Welcome to the MIT Museum. Excellent. Audience participation, that's perfect. So I'm Jenny Novotny. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here. And tonight you are joining us for our first of our Soapbox events happening today, next Wednesday, and the Wednesday after. And these events were inspired by our neuroscience exhibit, The Beautiful Brain. And in this event, in this series, we wanted to explore various aspects of neuroscience and have some interesting discussions. So for tonight, we are exploring Are We Our Brains? Next Wednesday, we are exploring what makes us human. And then the following Wednesday, we're exploring, can we shape the future of neuroscience? And so hopefully you guys will consider joining us for future programs. The Eventbrite for registration is open, and we are live streaming all of these. So even if you can't make it in person, you can still join us online, and we are having a discussion section online as well, so you can still join in. Tonight's program might be a little bit different than other things you've attended. For starters, you might not always sit at tables for normal neuroscience talks. And the reason behind that is that we want our audience to have an opportunity to discuss and talk with each other. So we're going to have 3 presentations, and then we're going to have an opportunity for you guys to talk amongst yourselves. And so we'll have opportunities for you guys to ask questions during that point, and then we'll be opening it up into a large group discussion and Q&A beyond that. So we're hoping to start a conversation together about neuroscience. But while I have you here, I want to give a quick short plug for future other events at the museum. So you might join us the next 3 Wednesdays. You might also consider joining us for a 21+ building event called Naughty Beers and Gears. And for this event, we'll be building Rube Goldberg-style machines here in this space while enjoying some beverages by local breweries. And this one will be nautical themed. We are opening a new exhibition mid this month about some nautical engineering here at MIT. And then that might even whet your appetite for our Friday after Thanksgiving chain reaction. We've been going for 21 years, and this is a wonderful event celebrating science and engineering here at MIT's campus. And so you might consider building or joining, and it's a wonderful way to spend Black Friday without perhaps going to a store, if that's your type of thing. But let's kind of jump into what we are actually here for. And so our first presenter for this evening is Anders Sandberg, and he is from Oxford University. And let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you so much for having me here. So I just flew in from Oxford, and boy, my arm's tired. I always want to make that tired joke. That's in the middle of my presentation. Yep, let's go to the start. So I'm a lapsed computational neuroscientist. I used to do models of memory over at Stockholm University, and then I got so interested in a lot of other stuff that I ended up in the philosophy department in Oxford, go figure. And I guess my job here is to kind of do the usual philosopher thing, wondering what do we mean by we and are and maybe even brains. Although the brain part is relatively straightforward. Humans have known about brains for at least a few thousand years. There are ancient Egyptian papyri describing them, including whether if there is this kind of brain damage, should you as a doctor actually take on the patient? Because they were very pragmatic about that. Some patients were unlikely to make it. And Aristotle rather famously were thinking about what does brains do? And he concluded that, they're probably for cooling the blood. And this was not just totally made up. He had been on a battlefield and he observed that, this kind of convolved surface probably pretty good for cooling. And it felt cooler than the rest of the body when he touched it. So some empirical data. He also observed that people with brain damage, they could live, but people with heart damage couldn't. Aha, the brain can't be essential. Of course, it turned out to be slightly wrong there, but this was partially the start of neuroscience. On the other hand, we have the mind part here. What is a mind? And this has kept philosophers up and busy for 2,500 years and with no show of stopping. So this is, of course, about our thoughts, our emotions, our subjective experience. And the relationship between the mind and the brain, that is partially what we're going to be talking about here. So philosophers have, of course, been trying to figure out what is the mind? Does it have parts? What kinds of bodies can have, or what kind of minds? So one interesting example of how you can divide this is this lovely diagram from Robert Flood, who basically took what was some ideas from the ancient Greeks and did a modern for the 1600s, an update on how it all works. So these are the various mental faculties and things outside that are feeding information into them. And this is roughly based on Aristotle's idea about what the mind was and what the parts it had. So to Aristotle, the soul was the form of our body or a form of our mind, essentially the essence. You can't actually have a different mind with a different body. He was very much what we today would call a monist. But actually, there is no separate souls. His pal Plato, on the other hand, argued that no, souls and minds are kind of eternal things out in the world of ideas, and then we have some bad copy of them wandering around this world of illusion, but actually the real thing is out there. Aristotle had a view, no, there are parts, and even plants have very simple minds, or rather he would have expressed it as a vegetable soul, a system that helps them grow and survive. And then animals, of course, got the sensitive mind that allows them to act. And then we humans, we are thinking beings, so we, of course, got a rational mind. And this is the parts that show up here. Now, an interesting thing is that in antiquity, people started thinking about maybe there are actually physical parts of the brain that correspond to this. So Galen, the Greek-Roman doctor, he argued that the ventricles, the empty spaces in the brain, that's probably where thinking happens. And he believed that there were 3 ventricles. Today we would categorize them as 4 ventricles. And a bit later, Avicenna, the Arabian scholar, actually argued that the first ventricle, that's probably going to be the rational mind, and then the middle one, well, that's going to be the animal one, and then you got the plant one in the final one. And an idea that came up here was, well, how do you do things? How do you regulate it? And this is, of course, where you need valves that have this thought liquid or whatever it is. And that's where the pineal gland comes in. So it might be he might be famous for a lot of different things like coordinate systems and the cogito ergo sum. But of course, we always like to poke a bit fun at Descartes for thinking that the pineal gland, that's where we do our thinking, which was not necessarily as stupid as it sounds. So this idea that the ventricles are somehow doing thinking fitted in rather well with the 1600s idea that actually we're probably hydraulic organisms. There's probably some liquids being pumped around along the nerves making our muscles move, and probably some liquid going from the eye to the brain to make us think. So he developed this theory about how these liquids make valves open and close and created impression on the pineal gland, and that's somehow where the soul was interfacing with the body. Exactly what he believed is rather complicated because he wrote several different accounts and they're incompatible. Philosophers have been going on endlessly since then. But it's interesting, he actually developed an early theory of learning that's not totally crazy, but repeated use of some of his channels make them widen. We would say, of course, that repeated uses of neurons make the synapses become stronger. On the other hand, of course, there are these big problems. How do you get this weird res cogitans, this thinking soul, interface with the res extensa, the physical body? What does the pineal gland actually do? And typically he got really annoyed when people started asking him about it. There are a lot of very testy answers in some of his letters to people actually asking him how his theory actually was supposed to work. I think if he was alive today, he would probably say, look, it's a model. I'm not really claiming this is exactly how it works. This is intended as a good model to start investigating. Now, it's interesting to see how we can then continue. One of the things he tried to get away from was, of course, the homunculus fallacy. The idea that there is a little guy sitting in our mind, kind of pulling levers and running us. However, that image really fits in with how we like to depict brains. So when neuroscience started to properly emerge in phrenology, there was quite often this depiction of the actions that we might take in the different parts of the brain the phrenologists believe they were doing. Now, today we tend to joke again about the poor phrenologists saying, haha, they were so wrong at measuring skulls. But the basic idea was actually not that bad. The idea that Gall and Weber had was basically that different parts of the brain have different functions. These faculties do correspond to faculties of the mind, and their size might actually tell us something. Then they went wrong and said, and that's why we can feel up on your skull to see whether you're smart or not. But their opponents were arguing that no, the brain is essentially a homogeneous, holistic thing. And that means that there shouldn't be any particular location doing anything particular. The interesting part here is both of them were right and wrong together. So while, for example, some of the enemies, like Florence, one of the neuroscientists who was arguing against the phrenologists, he did various lesion studies on brains and didn't find any particular part that seemed to correspond to any particular function. Except, of course, that he could do sensory disruptions, etc., but he argued that was too low level. The phrenologists actually got the last laugh when Broca, for example, found that, oh, there is a language center typically here in the left hemisphere. We got more and more evidence that different parts of the brains were doing things. The funny part is, of course, that gradually we refined our understanding. We got the neural doctrine that, oh, it's nerve cells that are actually doing the work. We developed a lot of tools to understand that. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over this a bit. But if we look at some of the cool modern visualizations, it turns out that both the phrenologists and critics actually got it a bit half right. So today we have very nice brain maps about what different parts of the cortex seem to be doing. And if you open a textbook, they will relatively self-assuredly tell you that this is somatosensory cortex and this is a language-related association cortex. They do different things. But if you actually put a test subject in the brain scanner and give them a task, you typically see activation all over the brain. So this is a visualization from the Gallant lab where they tell people a long story. And then they image the brain while the story is going on. So you find what different words activate in the brain. So you can make a guesstimate actually of which voxels in the brain that you image correspond to what words. And you find that it's essentially all the surface where you get activations, not just in language areas. You'd find certainly visually related words that they tend to activate areas that we normally ascribe to vision. But you also find them in other places. For example, just between the hemispheres, there is a small area on the left side, at least in this particular brain, because individual brains are different, where you find a voxel that reacts very strongly to words like God, universe, quantum, generally cosmic wooey stuff. While other voxels react to family members and the nearby voxel, family members and the sheriff and the crime, burglar. Essentially, as you move from the first voxel to the second one, you get into a crime story. And crime stories, probably in our mind, are closely related to families. My point here is that what we're finding out is that the brain does have a fairly complex structure. There are regularities to it. What this tells us about the mind, on the other hand, is rather tricky. We do know that by changing the brain, we can change the mind. Anybody who tried weird drugs will know that. We can see that lesions impair the function of mind. These days, you find relatively few people who are pure dualists. Most people realize that, yeah, the brain has a rather strong link to the mind. But exactly how that works is still actually quite mysterious. Not just because of obfuscation from us in the philosophy department, but we actually do need to do a fair bit of more neuroscience to inform the philosophy. So that was my kind of opening, and now I'm going to hand it over to the real scientists. Thank you.
All right, cool. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you fine folks tonight. So I, at Nectome, I think a lot about how memory works. And memory is very strange. And by the end of this talk, my promise to you is that you'll maybe understand a bit more just how strange memory is. And in order to convey this to you, I want to share with you a couple of stories. And the first story is about the slime mold. So slime molds are single cells, and they can fuse together with each other to form one giant mega cell that crawls across the forest floor and eats bacteria and detritus. And you can grow these in a lab, and you feed them Quaker oat flakes. And we normally think of memory as being a multicellular endeavor, but this single-celled organism can learn things, and it can have types of memory. And the way this works is you can put it in a test chamber where it's on one side here and the food's on the other side, but in order to get to the food, it's got to cross over some salt. And slime molds don't like salt, so it's very hesitant to cross over. But eventually it'll make its way across, maybe 3 hours or so. And once it does and it finds that food there, if you then take that slime mold and you put it in the same situation again, it'll go across faster. And if you do it again, it'll go even faster. And eventually it will ignore the salt entirely. And so this is a process we call habituation, but it's being done with just one cell. And I love these experiments because the slime molds are not really all that fast, even in the best of cases. So you can do one a day, and you're guessing whether it's going to take 3 hours to cross over or just 1 hour to cross over. And so once they're habituated, they can fuse with each other. So if you have a habituated mold that doesn't care about the salt, and you've got a slime mold that's naive, you can fuse them together, and even if they're fused for only a short amount of time for a slime mold, what happens is they both become habituated. And it's not like it diffuses out. It's not like they're half as habituated. They're both just fully habituated. So I look at the slime mold and I think, biology has spent billions of years crafting these incredibly exquisite cellular communication mechanisms. And the cells in your body, the glial cells in your brain, the neurons in your brain, they all inherit all of this complexity. Anything the slime mold can do, potentially, your cells in your brain can do. And then there's this question of, well, what does that kind of look like? And it leads us to the next example here, which is this beautiful sea slug called Naplesia. And a lot of the early work in neuroscience for the synaptic basis of memory was done in this animal. It puts out these beautiful purple clouds of smoke when it gets aggrieved. It lives on the bottom of the seafloor. And they have a really convenient feature, which is that they can learn this simple association memory. They have a little siphon, and they use it to get water in and to breathe. And if you touch the siphon, they don't really like it, so they'll pull it back in. And then maybe 10 seconds later, it comes back out. But if you're very mean to them and you give them an electric zap, then they'll pull that siphon in and they'll hold it for about a minute. And if you combine the two, the light touch and the zap, then it associates the touch with the zap. And so then later, if you give it a light touch, instead of it pulling down for 10 seconds, it pulls down for a whole minute, like it had been zapped. And what's really cool is you can actually see the result of this fear memory being created in these sea slugs. If you look at the sensory neurons, you're going to find that in the slugs that have the fear memory, they have more synapses and they have larger synapses. In fact, if you gave me some slugs, like 10 slugs, and you had made some of them fearful and some of them not, I could tell just by looking at their nervous systems which ones of them were fearful and which ones weren't. And so we built this whole idea about synaptic plasticity and how synapses change when you have memories. But there's this really fascinating result that's come out, which is you can take the actual sensory neurons out of an Naplesia that's been fearful and just blend them up into a slurry. And then you can extract just the RNA from that slurry and inject it into a new slug that hasn't ever been trained or doesn't have any reason to fear. And if you wait a little bit of time and you touch its siphon, it'll act like it's been zapped. And that is just amazing to me. So this brings us to the next example, which is C. elegans, these tiny little worms. And I actually work with these in my own lab. And they've got this amazing property where they remember the odors that they are born in. Wherever they hatch, they remember the smells that are around there. And it forms an imprinting memory. And if they can, when they're an adult, they'll try to go back to a place that smells that way so they can lay their own eggs. And first of all, it's amazing you can have a memory that stays with an animal that long, even though its body changes very considerably. But what's even crazier about this memory is that it's inheritable. So the next generation of C. elegans is simply born already wanting to go for this odor, whether the parent makes it to the same location or not. If this thing's born with a certain smell, right, it wants to go to that, you can move it to a new petri dish where that smell doesn't exist. It'll lay its egg, and that egg hatches. That worm will still want to go to that same smell, even though it's never experienced it. If you do it another generation, it doesn't have the imprinting memory. But if you do 5 generations of worms consecutively, and they all get the same smell, then it becomes permanent as far as we can tell. Even if you then don't give them the smell for 40 generations, and you take the 41st generation and you give it the opportunity to lay its eggs either someplace or with that smell, they'll go for it. And that's crazy. That's 40 generations. That would be like 5 generations of your family, like great-grandparents, times 41, which would be 1,200 years ago, all lived in the same place. And now you have this sort of genetic predisposition to the smells of that place. So does this exist in humans? We don't know, but I would not be shocked if it did, because we're part of the same biological machinery that enables it in these worms. So what about human memory? Well, a lot of people think that memory is a dynamic type of process, that it's some sort of pattern of activation in the brain. And that's not quite right, because there's a lot of examples of people falling through an icy lake. You have thin ice and you fall in and you drown. And you can't breathe, you have no heartbeat, you have no brain activity. If you were to hook up an EEG, everything's just flat. And you can stay in one of these icy lakes for an hour in this state. And when they pull you out, you look like you're dead. But it turns out that you can actually recover someone from this type of hypothermia if you're careful about rewarning them. And this is what leads to this phrase in resuscitation medicine that you're not dead until you're warm and dead. So we don't know everything about memory, but one thing we do know about it is that it's more durable and physical and static than we might have imagined. And in fact, this technique works so well that it's been turned into a surgical technique called deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. So this is the aorta, and imagine if you've got some sort of damage right here and you got to fix it. Well, that's not going to work all that well if you've got high pressure blood going through there. And if you could just make the blood stop for a while, you could fix this and save this person's life. And so we make a kind of synthetic version of falling through into a lake and cool people down so that you can stop all the circulation for about 40 minutes, do the repair, and then warm them back up and start the circulation. It saved a lot of lives. Now, we don't have the time to go through this, but these are some of my favorite papers about hypothermia. And if you're interested, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at them, because the whole literature in this field is really fascinating. But the main takeaway point here is that memories survive hypothermia. You can fall into a lake and come back, and you don't lose any of them. Likewise, ischemia does the same effect. Ischemia is where you have lack of blood flow to an organ. And with a brain, you run out of energy in 30 to 50 seconds and shut down, basically. But you can survive up to 7 minutes of ischemia. And there's a lot of profound changes that occur in the brain during this time. But even though they're very profound, none of them affect long-term memory. So we know that memory is durable, but can we say more about what it is in terms of what's it actually built? What are the physical changes that occur in a brain? And there's this amazing work that's been done recently, coming out of Japan by Hayashi Takagi, where he took mice and he trained them to do 2 different somewhat demanding motor tasks, the rotor rod and the balance beam. So balance beam is just your simple beam, and the rotor rod is kind of like those log games where you're standing on and you have to bounce on it and it's rotating underneath you. And the mice aren't all that good at these tasks initially, but with training they become better and better. And what they were able to do is they could watch what happens in this mouse's brain as it's learning these tasks. And they see that these synapses in its motor cortex become larger. And basically, each of these two different tasks gets its own set of distinct synapses in the motor cortex that change, kind of like how the aplysia has its synapses become larger when it learns this fear memory. And then they went another step. They came up with a method to reset the sizes of the synapses, but only the ones that were associated with one of these tasks. So they could selectively undo all the physical effects that had happened when it originally learned this task. And when they do this, they find that it erases the memory. A mouse that used to be a pro at the balance beam now will act like it's never seen a balance beam in its life before. But it doesn't affect the other task. If you erase the balance beam, they're still good at the rotorod. And if you erase the rotorod, they're still good at the balance beam. So this is the start of research that's showing that the physical changes in the brain that survive all these other profound states like hypothermia, they're based around changing the structure of the brain. They're based around creating new proteins at synapses. So this is the main takeaway here, that the brain is a biological system, and there's a billion years of complex cellular signaling that it inherits in addition to all of the other neuronal activities that can do. So if you have a theory of the brain that's very simplifying, don't be surprised if neurons can pull out some pretty crazy stuff. But on the other hand, these things are not completely mysterious. You can get really powerful constraints on how memory has to work by looking at the things that doesn't disrupt it. So the systems that are disrupted by hypothermia and ischemia clearly, at best, redundantly encode memory. And really, I think that there's no better time to be in neuroscience than today, because a lot of these results have been done very recently. The C. elegans intergenerational stuff was 2010. The SIMOLD stuff was just 2 years ago, and the C-slug stuff was done this year. So I'm very optimistic about what we're going to learn, and very excited. There you go.
Excellent. So while we're getting set up, that was Robert McIntyre. He is the co-founder of Nectome, which is a startup company in California, doing some really interesting work, and we'll probably get a couple questions around that to further explore during our later session. And now our final presenter for the evening is Alan Jasanoff, and he is a professor here at MIT in the biological engineering department and in brain and cognitive sciences, and with a couple other co-appointments as well. And so while we're getting the computer to cooperate.
It's MIT. This type of stuff always happens.
It is amazing the number of times we've had computers restart mid-presentation. We've had quite a few updates happen. So we just all kind of go along with the flow. So while we are waiting, kind of a quick show of hands, who's been to the MIT Museum before? How are we? Oh, pretty decent, pretty decent. This side of the audience is the newer folks. This side's people who have been here before. Have you guys visited the Beautiful Brain exhibition yet? Few hands, see some yeses, see some nos. Well, you have until December 31st to check it out. And with that stalling technique, Alan.
And I highly recommend the permanent exhibit as well. The Cajal drawings are beautiful, but so are the sculptures and holograms and robots and everything you could want from an MIT museum. In any case, we've just heard some of what makes our brains great. And I'm showing you this picture here because I think people are increasingly thinking that their brains are this great. This is a mystical brain. It's sparkling with internal energy. It's glowing. It's disembodied. It's almost like a physical version of our souls. And if you are a person who feels that way about their brain, or if you know people who feel that way about their brains, they're getting help from actually some very distinguished people. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, wrote a very influential book in 1994 where he claimed, "You are nothing more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You are your brain," in just a few words. Eric Kandel, who won a Nobel Prize for his studies of memory, actually in that beautiful organism that Robert just showed you, the sea slug, has written, "Every activity we engage in, every feeling, thought that gives us our sense of individuality, emanates from our brain. It's like the brain is the source of who we are and what we do. And here is a quote from Brian Johnson, who's a tech entrepreneur. "Everything we are, everything we build, and everything we aspire to become stems from the brain." And he uses this as part of his argument that we should all get brain chips to augment our cognition. You can see that a lot of distinguished people, as I say, believe that we are our brains. And to me, this kind of harkens to this the philosophy of Descartes that Anders told us about. This idea that, well, the mind and body are in a dualistic, a separated relationship to one another, that the mind is different from the body in its substance. It kind of hovers above us in some way and acts through our pineal glands to make us do what we do. But in the modern version, we have something else. We have brain-body dualism, not mind-body dualism, where the brain is different from the body in substance and causal relationships. And that's part of how we can imagine the brain as the source of what we do, as the source of our actions, and also as the embodiment of who we are. But this is wrong. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining why that's true, and in a few different flavors. So I want to tell you that, well, other things help you be who you are. And your body is the most obvious example. The brain is not by itself. It doesn't have an independent existence without your body. There are many, many examples of how your brain and body are in reciprocal causal relations. And this slide shows one example where you can see a close-up of part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It releases certain hormones in periods of stress that act on other parts of your body, most famously the pituitary and the adrenal cortex, to release a stress hormone called cortisol. Probably everybody here knows about cortisol because it's a very powerful chemical substance that circulates in your body, and it actually creates your body-wide stress response. But what you may be less aware of is that, well, that cortisol then acts back on your brain, and it does that in multiple ways. It does it both chemically, just by going back into the brain and actually making changes directly, but it also does that because, of course, these body-wide responses that take place are things that we perceive. They're things that alter the way that we feel and the way that we act. And this is really one of many examples of how chemicals and organ systems in our body, even the microbes that live in our guts, communicate with the brain. And they're in many cases yanking on the strings that alter our brains and what we think. It's not just the brain acting on them and feeding back. It goes both ways. It's particularly important for our emotional reactions. So cortisol in particular is important in the fight or flight response. It's important in stress reactions. But a group of scientists in Finland did what I think is a pretty remarkable study where they got groups of people to label on drawings of a body how they perceive different emotions. This is sort of a slightly crude way to report this, where they mark, sort of the orange is marking activation of those bodily areas, and the blue is marking deactivation. I mean, that's not really how we feel things, but at least you can sort of imagine, okay, if I feel my heart pumping harder, I'll say that's activation. But in any case, what this group did was what the researchers found was that when aggregating the results over all these subjects, each emotion could actually be related to a distinct pattern of bodily responses, and this generalized across cultures. So in other words, they actually looked, I think, at a subset of subjects who were Finnish and another group that were, I believe, Japanese, and got similar results. So it's really, I think, a remarkable illustration of how our experience of emotions actually ties into our bodies. It's not just stuff that's happening by itself in our brains. The shape of your body makes you who you are. And some of you may be aware of a field called Embodied Cognition. It's actually a pretty cool area that sort of analyzes how the ways that we behave, or even robots behave, can be shaped in remarkably complex ways by simple aspects of the mechanics of their bodies, how we use our bodies. I like to cite the example of the celebrated violinist and composer Niccolo Paganini. Paganini, some of you may know, is famous for his remarkable performances of violin pieces. He once supposedly played an entire piece on one string of his violin after the other strings broke by accident in a concert. But he was famous also for writing virtuosic pieces that only he could perform. And he could do this because he suffered from a rare connective tissue disease called Marfan Syndrome. Sometimes people think Abraham Lincoln had this. But in any case, the form of his body gave him the ability to do these things, and they influenced his compositions, which we often think of as the most kind of cognitive aspect of what a musician does. Mozart was a genius because of his compositions, and Paganini was as well, though not as much. So his doctor said, to become Paganini, musical genius was not sufficient. One needs the physical structure which he holds. So it's I think, a good example of how the body is important. Your environment makes you who you are as well. And many people think in terms of nature and nurture, and of course we all know that our upbringing helps us develop our memories, helps train us. That's not what I'm talking about. I think there's very little disagreement over that. What people, I think, are less aware of is how the environment shapes our instantaneous behavior. What this slide over here shows is some brain imaging results where a group of people were watching the same movie, and then the scientists correlated the brain activity in one person with all the other people. And what this orange color everywhere in the brain is showing you is that actually the activity across the entire brain was correlated among people watching the same movie. It's not only in the areas that, saw the sights, heard the sounds, those are areas over here or there. It's also the frontal regions, the parts under our forehead, which are the most cognitively advanced. In effect, the movie is hijacking the brains of these people. It's governing what they are and who they are at that moment. Here's another really remarkable example of how the environment makes you who you are. It's the idea that the climate actually governs our behavior, or at least contributes to our behavior. The two panels here are from a meta-analysis by someone named Solomon Shung at Princeton, who analyzed the effect of temperature on aggression. It turns out that the warmer it is, the meaner we get, on average. Did you know that? Anyway, it's very cold in here, so we're all very nice. This panel over here is graphing violent personal crime episodes, aggregated over many, many, many examples, but as a function of temperature in different jurisdictions. And on the right, from your perspective, is another graph that's diagramming civil conflicts as a function of deviations from standard temperature. And these relationships actually hold even on hourly timescales. So, timescales that can't be explained by, oh yeah, it's nice weather, so everyone went out and started bar brawls. It's actually, I think, quite phenomenal. Your social context makes you who you are. I'm showing you a picture of Charles Whitman, one of America's first and most famous mass murderers. He took a gun, climbed up the tower at the center of the UT Austin campus, and shot over a dozen people to death. And after he was killed in the episode, his brain was autopsied, and it was found that there was a little tumor right above part of his brain called the amygdala, which is important for emotional regulation. And many people have cited the case of Charles Whitman as an example of how the brain causes behavior, how this defect in his brain, the tumor growing near his amygdala, actually caused him to become violent. It's always been speculative, but it's still been cited by people who want to argue that the brain causes behavior. What I want to argue, though, is that it's only part of the story. So here's a picture of Charles Whitman smiling in a military uniform with his wife and mother. He was a Marine. And the picture is actually slightly ironic because everyone's smiling, but it was actually the day of his court-martial. He was court-martialed for bad performance. He had a very unhappy professional life, and his family is being supportive here. But it was actually source of continual stress. And in fact, just months before he committed his act, his divorced. His father was a violent character with whom he had a very difficult relationship. So this was very present in his life as right before his crime. He was trained in the use of high-powered weaponry, and he owned it. He had access to it. This was part of who he was. He had these guns. And he was also dependent on substances. When his body was found, he had a large supply of amphetamines on him. So I think that blaming Whitman's crime on his brain is sort of like blaming, let's say, the outcome of the 2016 election on any particular factor that took place then. It's just really difficult to tease out different causative factors. Was it any one of these things? No, it was probably all of them, and we can't ever figure out which one it is. And again, I want to point out that this is not just nature versus nurture. These are stimuli, facts of his life that were acting on him right at the moment of his crime. So there is something very instantaneous about how his social context influenced him. So, why is it important to realize that we are more than our brains? I think there are a few reasons for this. One is it's scientifically accurate. We are more than our brains, and it actually, it can steer our research. As a scientist, I care about that, but many other things as well. So it improves our ability to grapple with problems of the mind. If we believe that our minds are reduced to our brains, it will narrow our focus, particularly when we think about mental problems. Are mental disorders brain disorders? Well, in some cases, brain disorders might cause mental disorders, but they're not equal. There are multiple factors that come into mental disorders. I think that realizing that our brains are not who we are, not only who we are, also increases our awareness of culture and the environment and how these things shape us and guide us. And I also think that that can point us in ways that might help us improve who we are and what's around us. Let me just leave with a final thought, which is that the brain isn't just a physical version of the soul or mind. It's actually a nexus that ties us into the world. It's a physical thing, and it's required for who we are, but it's not who we are. Thank you.
Fantastic. So hopefully those 3 talks gave you a lot to chew on. I definitely have a lot of great questions. So now we're moving into the section of the evening that's the hard part for you guys, and that's going to be small group discussions at your tables. And so we're going to set aside probably the next 15 to 20 minutes for you to talk to each other at your tables, ask questions, talk about what you enjoyed, what you didn't like, what's maybe resonating with you, what's not. And then we're starting to pass out iPads. These iPads are all logged into a Twitter account, and you can also tweet questions you have or thoughts you have, and we'll be having a running screen of people's tweets coming up here. The trick, though, in order for your tweet to show up, is that it has to include hashtag MIT Soapbox. So for your tweet to show up, you have to include the hashtag MIT Soapbox. After the small group discussions, there will be opportunity for large group Q&A as well. Feel free to get more snacks, but we'll spend about 15 to 20 minutes in small group discussions. All right, everyone, why don't we now bring it all back together for our large group Q&A. So if I could have Robert and Alan and Anders up here. Feel like it's going to be easier for you to field questions if you're close together. Q&A. Perfect. So I'm going to be passing the microphone, and then we have a microphone for the audience questions as well. And so I think Carly will be running around with a microphone. And so if you do have a question, please say it into the microphone so that way when we are recording this, people can hear it who are not in this room. We have a smaller group, so we will be able to hear it, but our digital audience won't. So Carly will be going around with a microphone. I pulled one of the questions from the Twitter fall. that I thought might be a starting space, and I'll figure you guys can rock, paper, scissors, or reach for the microphone to answer. So the first question is, are there examples of emerging memory at the society scale where humans just act unaware of their contribution, like slime mold cells?
I'm happy to start. So at least if we include skills as memories, and I think we can do that by extending the concept of memory, I think we definitely have good examples. Nobody knows how to make a microprocessor. That takes just too many different forms of engineering and science, but we distribute it. And I think that happens quite a lot of the time. We actually have a lot of memories on a society scale that we do division of labor and spread it out between different experts. Also, there are family scale memories. One of my favorite facts about memory research is that quite often that kids dispute the ownership of certain memories. They all know that somebody had that experience, but not who had it. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in distributed memory.
I think one of the issues that actually we were discussing before all of you came is what exactly is a memory? Is a memory the trace of a memory that's in your brain? Because that is, of course, a very important aspect of the memory for each of us. But memory could be something as simple as, you know, a penny that I dropped as I was leaving work today. Memory could be the tracks of skis or whatever they were in the snowscape that you showed, Robert. And certainly our society has many tracks, and they steer every aspect of what we're doing, and that's why we're here.
I guess to add to that, you know, I think that a good way to think about it is in terms of mutual information. Like, does this physical thing allow you to predict how this other physical thing looks? And if you want to call that a memory, that at least can give you some good, consistent definitions of memory. And it leads to some weird things like a scar being a memory that you might not normally think of. But in terms of society, I'd say the libraries that we have and the internet that we have are like the global memory. And then we're, you know, things that help to make more of it.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I'm happy to keep going from Twitter.
Hey, okay, so just a hypothetical thing that we were talking about in the lab before this. So, you know, if you wake up somewhat, just hypothetical, that you could preserve a brain and wake them back up with maybe digital consciousness, right? If you brought someone from the 1500s and woke them up like today, I mean, they would immediately have to go back to school and like learn all the things that happened from when they died or, you know, stopped to the modern day. So hypothetically, since y'all are here, if say someone was preserved from now, or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, and you wake them up like 400 years from now, what kind of things do you think you might have to teach them to bring them up to speed?
Well, to me, this is actually personally relevant. I'm actually signed up for cryonics. So I'm willing, as a futurist, to put my money where my mouth is. So this is instruction to freeze me in the case of me dying. Whether this is money well spent or not, we might debate, especially in 400 years' time. And generally, of course, if I were to find myself in 400 years, I would probably definitely need to get back to school or whatever. But I'm fine with that, because that would mean I at least survived. I generally think that it's a kind of being a temporal refugee. We might have a moral duty to accept refugees in space. If you can't survive in a remote location, you might need to flee somewhere else. If I can't survive in the present, maybe I can flee to the future. And that's, of course, going to be very tough. But it's better than being dead. But I do think that there is an interesting challenge in handling kind of trans-temporal justice. I'm actually writing papers about it. As I said, I love being in the philosophy department. I actually get to work on this.
Although, you know, one of the great things about being human is you get to define what your own personal identity is. So I wouldn't want to underplay this idea of waking up 400 years in the future. You know, for certain people, they can leave their country and they can leave their families and they can leave everything they've seen, and they understand their own personal identity as being more individualistic, and I think that they might tolerate that. But there's certainly people that I don't think could tolerate that. You know, you wake up and your religion is gone. It's just in the history textbooks. I think that'd be hard. If you got someone from Egypt 2,000 years ago and you told them that we don't worship Ra anymore. I think that could hit you really hard. But what hits you maybe even harder is maybe your family's not around. So, yeah, you get these same issues. But these are not new issues. People deal with this all the time. If your country's in civil war and you have to leave and you have to move to a totally different country and a totally different language, it seems that people can actually adapt to it. At least some of them can.
I think that's a beautiful way to discuss it, and I think that it really gets to the core of what about you actually matters to who you are, because there's no doubt that waking up in this future world, you might actually have, for instance, the same tastes in food. You like sweet things, you don't like salty things, although I think that's wrong. You might like people who treat you in a certain way, and so on, and that's probably not going to change too easily. But even within a single place and time, you can change who you are. People become unrecognizable, and the example I like to cite is World War I, possibly World War II too, where tens of millions of people were uprooted from their ordinary lives and turned into killers. Those people were not recognizable in their new context. They were different people in some fundamental sense. They were also the same people in some fundamental sense, but I believe that that's the kind of thing that would happen in your scenario, Amy.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think that a lot of them compartmentalize it. You go and you'd run the death camps by day, and you come home and you'd be like you used to be with your family. That's what's even more scary, is that they didn't change into incomprehensible people. But I would say we're better today at dealing with refugees than we were 2,000 years ago. And 400 years from now, we'd probably be better at dealing with refugees than we are today. So in addition to your own personal understanding of what's important to you, society's ability to reintegrate and reeducate you and help you to recover with the therapy that you need to reintegrate, I imagine would only improve over time. So that's something to think about too.
Looks like we might have a question right there. Microphone is coming.
There you go. Hi, Mike. Well, this, don't know whether I feel good about this, triggered something in me that you talked about waking someone up. Well, I'm a TBI survivor from June 13th, 2006. And they found me at the bottom of the stairs. Fortunately, they were short stairs and padded, and so there were not too many physical, but I was in a coma for a long time. Didn't know if I was going to wake up. I did. And this is from June 13th, 2006. And it was like everything changed. Everything changed. It took a long time. In the beginning, things I said were totally bizarre. And my wife wrote them down. I mean, none of it made sense. And slowly, I got back to being able to do that. And people who I know, who I haven't seen before, who see me after and say, well, you're different. You feel everything's different. I wouldn't have raised my hand and talked like this. I would have been too inhibited to do that. And my work as an artist changed. My life changed. My connection to music. And there's a lot about music and memory that I think is crucial and important. This film, Alive Inside, and Oliver Sacks talking about the part of your brain called the music box and how that triggers memories. But I didn't plan on talking about this. It's very upsetting because I go to support groups at Spalding and I see people who are not what they were. One gentleman who was 2 years old when he was hit by a car is in a wheelchair, but he has the greatest sense of humor and the best jokes ever. So you find something else that you can channel into or use your brain for. Anyway.
I think you learned in a very personal way how important your brain is to you, and that's a deep and important experience. And I think you also learned, if I understood correctly, how important everything around you was to you as well. Because if you didn't have your wife to help you through that, if you didn't have the context you had, you wouldn't have made it. And one of the things I think is actually quite remarkable, and this is maybe less intuitive to everyone here, is the idea that actually you can get changes in the rest of your body that cause upheavals at the level that you've reported, or at least comparable upheavals. One of the really flashy results that people have discussed recently is the idea that the microbes in your gut, I alluded to them in my talk, can actually cause significant emotional changes in the way you are. I think it's more intuitive, perhaps, that if you lose a limb, let's say, you can really be dramatically affected. And we all know that if we lose people who are close to us, lose our house, these things are all outside the brain, and they can have, really, I think, comparably, at least, devastating consequences. And so, in a sense, our ability to recover may depend on, keeping those parts intact that are there.
Technology that's available now for people who are survivors is incredible. There are people who they went and volunteered, went back, and they talked to patients, and running a computer with a thing in his mouth or something. It's this side of technology that I think is incredible.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story. My dad is actually a psychiatrist, and one of the first things he looks at when someone comes in with some type of psychosis is, especially if you have some problem in the GI tract, because often it's your body's metabolism being way off kilter, and that's causing the psychological effects. And sometimes what would have been years of totally ineffective treatment with psychiatric medication, you can fix by addressing the problem with the body, and then you're good. So yeah, that's actually very much well recognized clinically.
Well, ironically, I fell because I was over-medicated by a psychiatrist. Anyway.
It's also interesting to note that even the philosophers are starting to take this into account. For a very long, my home field in philosophy is ethics, and for a very long time, ethics has been about you have this very nice abstract conception of what a human being is, and then you make nice arguments about that. And relatively recently, people actually got the idea, what about the psychology of ethics? Actually, the moral behavior is kind of running on, at least on a mind. Nobody at that point were talking about brains. And then a bit later, somebody got into their head, maybe we can put some people in a brain scanner and actually give them a few moral dilemmas and see what happens. And of course, there are correlates. It's not that easy to make heads or tails of a whole story, but obviously there are quite important links here. And that, of course, changes quite a lot of things also for ethics. Because, well, if I'm behaving nicely to people, that might be just because I have the right energy levels, that I drank enough coffee. And similarly, of course, personal identity, another perennial favorite in philosophy. Again, neuroscience is kind of undermining many forms of personal identity, but also giving us interesting tools to think about our narrative identity, because quite a lot of how we make sense of our lives is the stories we tell ourselves, including how we are the same and how we change. And that is very important to us. So even though deep down there might not be a real personal identity, we certainly have very important stories that actually have very important effects on how our lives work. And then they, of course, interweave with what happens in our stomach and other of the more bodily sides.
Fantastic. So I think we're actually out of time there. So let's give our presenters a big round of applause.